Hi guys, I'm Carly. Welcome to Point Blank's Friday Forum Live. For those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar with us, we're an electronic music school. We've got a school here in London, one in LA, Ibiza, and online. We offer courses like DJing, music production, sound engineering, and radio. We also offer BA degrees, which are certified by Middlesex University. And you can find out more about all that kind of stuff on our website, pointblankmusicschool.com. Today we are joined by one of our London instructors, Paul Ressel, who's going to be talking through Arturia Oberheim SEM V2 synthesizer. Don't forget, we are streaming live and we love your questions. So if you do have any, please just post them in the comment section of this video and we will get to them shortly. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Carly. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Excellent.
Cool. So today we're going to be looking at the Oberheim. So this is a software emulator of the old school synth from the 70s.
This is an emulation of the original, Tom Oberheim's original SEM synthesizer, which basically stands for Synthesizer Expansion Module, or Synthesizer Expander Module. And it's a bit of a strange story. It's quite unlike a lot of the synthesizers from the time, because at the time, Oberheim were competing with companies like Arp, who were making the Arp 2600 and the big Moog modulars, and all these like massive sort of complicated synths. And basically what Tom Oberheim wanted to do was create a small synth module that could be like an addition to your current synthesis setup, and something that you could basically run with a sequencer. So the idea was to create something really quite uncomplicated, but the beauty of it was that it sounds amazing. It's a really incredible.
Hear what it sounds like?
Yeah, absolutely. So
it's a tune.
The synth is great for a number of things. So one of those things is pads. So sort of just creating like really kind of deep pad sounds, a lot of movements, a lot of like modulation in the sound as well. It also does some very good sort of lead sounds as well. So if I just go over to, so these are some patches I created a little bit earlier. So you get like really sort of big, interesting kind of fat sounds as well. And then the thing it's probably most known for are the actual sequences themselves. So here's a couple of sort of different ones. Just kind of create these like nice, big, sort of dreamy, thick sounding.
Nice. A bit Stranger Things, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, kind of going through some of the preset banks, I heard like lots of sounds that reminded me a lot of the sort of Stranger Things soundtrack. But the beauty of the synth really is that it's very uncomplicated. So people who are familiar with modular synthesis will find it quite easy to kind of get stuck in with this. So let's maybe have a look at the panel, and then we can sort of see what's going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it to a just a basic template. So let's just find these here. So I'm just going to start off with a very basic sound. So this is just the basic sawtooth wave. So the synth basically has two oscillators, two VCOs here, and each one basically has two waveforms associated to it. So there's a sawtooth wave and a pulse wave as well. And everything is basically sort of centered around those two waveforms. So there's lots of pulse width modulation. Sawtooth, everything has a lot of harmonics in it, and you'll kind of hear as we start kind of building sounds with it, it's all about sort of moving those harmonics together and getting like really interesting textures. So this little centerpiece here, where it says Synthesizer Expander Module, this is actually the original SEM. So this is kind of what you bought back in the day in the 70s, where you kind of got the original. It would have been literally this unit here.
Have you played around with the original one?
I unfortunately haven't gotten my hands on one. It would be fantastic to. But I have seen a lot of comparisons between the original and the emulated version, and it seems to compare quite favorably.
Didn't they do an updated version as well?
There was the original SEMV, and then the V2 is basically the latest version. But what I want to show you is just, if you have a look here, I've kind of set up just an oscilloscope as well, so we can have a look at the waveforms. And if you have a look at the sawtooth, for example, so the very kind of basic sawtooth wave, you can see it doesn't really conform to the shape that you'd expect from a sawtooth. It's kind of got like that sort of exponential curve to it, as opposed to like a straight line. You know, when you think of a sawtooth wave, you kind of think of these very sort of straight lines. And that's basically part of Arturia's TAE technology, which is this emulation to kind of make as close as possible to the original analog sound that they can, how they've sort of like emulated the circuits and that sort of thing. And you can see the same thing when you sort of move to the pulse wave as well. So you can see most of the time you expect a pulse wave to be flat, like completely sort of squared off. But you can see it's got a bit of a curve there, and there's a little bit of kind of noise in it as well. And it's all that stuff that basically gives the synth its character. Okay. So another big thing about the SEM is that it's hardwired, which means there's no patching. And this again was part of like Tom Oberheim's ideas, that he wanted to have a synthesizer that was really easy to use. You could literally just pick it up, and in a couple of minutes you could get the hang of how to make sounds with it and that sort of thing. So you'll see all the modulation is basically handled by switches and then the knobs as well. So for example, if we look over here at the oscillator section, you've got the frequency, so main frequency for oscillator 1. So those are obviously at the moment jumping up in semitones. You've got modulation settings, which we'll come back to a little bit later. And the next section along is the VCF, so this is the filter. And the filter basically has two roles here. So it obviously acts as the filter itself. So it's a 12 dB per octave filter. And then you've got your sort of frequency and resonance. So not necessarily the most exciting sounding kind of filter ever. It's quite gentle. We're kind of used to using sort of 24 dB per octave filters, which have a much sort of deeper curve. So you get a much more sort of intense resonant sound with it. But what does make this synth quite unique is that you've got this filter mode, and it's a continuous variable between low pass and high pass. So normally on a filter, you can kind of switch between. So you can select low pass, high pass, band pass, notch, whatever it might be. But what's really unique about this is that you can actually sort of you can move the sort of variation between the low pass and the high pass. So if you think about it, you put that kind of thing onto, say, a controller or something, it gives you some really nice movements. So just to have a look at sort of how the whole thing works. So like I said, for each VCO, you've basically got two waveforms. You've got the pulse wave and the sawtooth wave. And the thing is, you can only use one or the other for each oscillator. So how that's controlled is by this section at the bottom of the VCF. You basically have these three knobs, and they control the amount of waveform basically for each oscillation. So if I wanted a sawtooth wave on oscillator 1, I could basically push that up there. Let's open this up a bit. If I wanted a pulse wave on oscillator 2, I can push that up there. And you can kind of see now how you sort of have this perfect mix between a pulse wave and a sawtooth wave as they're added together on the oscilloscope. And that's basically how you control the volume as well, is just how much you sort of send it to. What's slightly different from the sort of original expansion module is that you have all these extra sections as well. So one of the things that Arturia added was a sub-oscillator. So just to kind of give it a bit more beefiness, give it some bass, and the sub-oscillator's frequency is linked to the frequency of the first VCO.
Right.
And basically what you can do is you can kind of select a different waveform. So if we go sort of sine wave over here, and then you bring in the sub using this external mixer here, and then you can hear that kind of like lower frequency underneath. So it just kind of adds a little sort of bottom end to it as well. And there's a couple of different waveform choices. You've got the sawtooth and the pulse wave as well. And then you can basically choose whether it's 1 octave below or 2 octaves below.
Okay.
So there's a lot of room for making kind of bass sounds as well, like really kind of deep sort of tones. So over here are the two envelope sections. So you've got envelope 1, which is basically your main amplitude envelope. So those who are familiar with synthesis will already notice quite a big omission because these envelopes basically are attack, decay, sustain. So they're called ADS envelopes, whereas in most synthesizers you get ADSR, which is attack, decay, sustain, release. So the idea here is that the decay and the release are basically linked together.
Oh, okay.
So you don't actually need to have the extra sort of release for that. So if you wanted to kind of increase the tail of the sound, you could basically do that just by increasing the decay on envelope 1. So you get sort of, much longer, sort of more kind of expansive sounds out of it. And then envelope 2 is purely for modulation. So maybe this is a good time to talk a bit about the modulation and how it kind of works. And again, at this point, if you're working on a Moog modular or even sort of an ARP 2600, you kind of you're reaching for your patch cables now, and it's now time to start working out how to plug everything in. But with this, because it's all hardwired, it's just about settings. Okay. So basically setting like how things are modulated. So to have modulation, you need a source, so something that kind of provides the modulation. You need a target, something to send that modulation to. And then it's just about amount, so how much modulation actually happens. So the way it sort of works here, I'll show you quite quickly. If, for example, we go to VCO1, you can see under here there's two modulation options. So we've got pulse width and we've got frequency. So frequency is obviously pitch, right? So what I can do is I can go to, let's say, we'll keep it here at the moment, so on LFO1, which is this little LFO over here. And I can basically just start creating that pitch modulation. And the amount is basically just controlled by that slider there. And then, of course, the speed is controlled by the LFO here. So that's a really simplistic LFO. And again, this is kind of what you would have found in the original box itself, like the original expander module. So what Arturia did was they added an extra LFO. So over here they added LFO2, which is a little bit more detailed to it. So you can choose things like different waveforms. You can obviously control the rates. You can sync it. You can also sync LFO1 as well. You can also set it to re-trigger mode. And this is my favorite, is you can actually set a fade in. So what that does is it fades in the strength of the LFO over time. So you can, if you're building synth, like pad sounds and that kind of thing, you can sort of like really kind of have them grow over time, right? So let me show you like how that would sound. So if we set this to pulse width on oscillator 2, and then I'm going to set this to LFO 2. And you can kind of hear how the modulation is getting more and more intense like over time. And that's basically all because of this fade control. So the fade control, the way you could think about it, is it's kind of like a little envelope basically built into the LFO. So it's just about how long it takes to kind of get to its main sound. And you can kind of, once you've sort of like worked out the basics of the modulation, you can see it all kind of like works in the same way. Another addition, if you look back at the VCF area over here, is that besides the sub-oscillator that we sort of have here, let me just bring that down so we can hear it, so you can really kind of like hear the bass there. There is also a noise generator as well. So this is like something else that Arturia added to the synth. So nice pure white noise, just for adding a little bit of sort of distortion to the sound as well. So another sort of big feature of the SEM was this little button here, which is sync mode. And I know for some people, oscillator sync can be quite confusing, but it's a fairly simple idea. And what's happening at the moment is VCO1 and VCO2, so the two oscillators, are basically operating completely independent of each other. So if you have different sort of settings, so I can tune the two oscillators completely differently from each other, which is kind of what you'd expect from a normal synthesizer. So you can create like fifths and chords and that kind of thing, and sort of build like thicker sounds. But one of the options you have here is to basically set sync mode, and what sync mode does, if you think about a waveform, so if we just had a look here at the oscilloscope, in fact, I'll tell you what, let's go back to just the basic sawtooth wave, just so it's easier to kind of see what's going on here. If you have a look at it, if I select the sync mode, and then what I'll do is I'll set VCO2 to a saw wave as well. If it's not in sync mode, you can see how the waveform gets very complicated as I'm bringing in different harmonics, right? It's just getting more and more complicated. So I'll put them back to unison, so they're both at the same pitch. And then when I change it to sync, can you hear it's not affecting the pitch as much? So basically what's happening is every time LFO1 restarts, so if you just look at a simple waveform, that's basically just it's a wave cycle repeating constantly. So it's a periodic waveform, just repeating over and over and over. And what happens when you set it to sync mode is that every time the waveform on oscillator 1 restarts, it forces the waveform from oscillator 2 to restart as well. So it effectively kind of syncs them together. So what that means is that instead of getting, you can kind of hear all those interesting harmonics. So there's not as much of an effect on the actual tuning of the sound because the oscillator is now becoming essentially extra harmonics on the sounds of oscillator 1. So like much sort of higher harmonics. So it's just increasing the harmonic richness instead of basically actually being a contradictory tune or a contradictory pitch to it. And this is pretty cool because you can create some really interesting sounds, especially when you start moving that sort of pulse width. So if I set the modulation to pulse width, let's set it to LFO2. You can hear all that like really interesting movement in there now. Just has like all these rich like deep harmonics. It's a really it's just got so much character to it. So one of the things the sort of SEM was originally built for was to be basically run by a sequencer. So something kind of triggering it. And again, like the idea was that, you know, you've got your ARP 2600 back in the 70s and your big Moogs, and those were kind of like your main synthesizers. And then you could have this little expansion module to basically sit there and then get kind of triggered by just a sequencer. So it's kind of like, you know, you kind of set it to do its own thing and it just goes and does its own thing. So that being said, there's a lot of sort of sequencing options that Arturia built into this. And one of those is just the Arpeggiator. So if you have a look on the top left, you can see the Arpeggiator window. And it's kind of exactly what you'd expect from an Arpeggiator. You know, you've got basic functions like you can set hold as well. So hold will basically just, you know, you can kind of let go of the keyboard, it'll just kind of like hold it in place. You can set it to sync to tempo as well. And then the different directions, up, down, up and down, and then sort of randomization. And then these controls here basically set how many octaves it sort of jumps through. So at the moment it's just going through one octave, but you can kind of increase that. So you can see it kind of like jump through like all those different octaves. And then just to kind of finish off on the panel, you've got your sort of main tuning, and then portamento, which is kind of like, you can hear it sort of like glides between the notes as well. So we'll come back to the effects here in a moment. But I mean, that's basically, there's really not much more to it. It's actually, like I said, it's a very like uncomplicated synthesizer, but it's capable of so much sound. And again, what Arturia usually do when they do these emulations is they add a lot of functionality. So if you go over here, there's two buttons you can click, and they both do the same thing. So either you click the sort of little power button up here, or these double arrows at the top, and this basically opens up this whole modulation area. So this is again part of kind of building sort of like interesting sounds over time, so creating sequences that have movement in them. So the area I want to show you first is the 8-voice programmer. So what this allows you to do, it's a little 8-step sequencer, and you can see if we just power it on there, you can kind of see like how it's sort of moving along with the arpeggiator. And what I can do with these kind of things is I can start actually drawing in automation for the different parts of the synth. So at the moment, this top one is set to the VCF frequency. So I can do, let's just try something, see what happens. So you can hear for the first half of the sequence, the filter's closed, and then it kind of like opens up. And you can start getting as creative as you like with this sort of thing. So you can kind of like create some really interesting sort of movements. And basically almost every parameter is assignable. Right. So you can assign, for example, we've got the VCF resonance here as well. So if we go down to this one, we can start just putting in some little, and you can hear, so that'll basically push the resonance up, so you get like sort of extra resonance in certain points. If we want to, I'm just going to turn the sustain all the way down, just so we have like a much shorter kind of little sequence. And then you can do this kind of stuff as well. So if you go to the envelope 1 decay lane, so you can have like slightly longer ones. So you can kind of create like, sort of more interesting rhythms. And then finally, you've got the actual VCO sort of tuning as well. So you can actually change notes. Now it's tricky because it's done in percentages. It doesn't sort of jump up in semitones.
Oh, right.
So you have to really listen.
You just have to use your ears.
You have to use your ears to try and like get the tuning right. So you can kind of create these like really interesting sort of sequences that have a lot of movement, a lot of modulation in them. And then besides that, there is this modulation matrix as well. So again, this is all kind of like added functionality. And here, I mean, you can see it's the classic sort of modulation setup. So you've got source, destination, and then how much. So for example, I could do things like, say, take the mod wheel, so the mod wheel on the keyboard, and I could apply that to, let's say, for example, the VCF mode. So this will basically be the shifting from low pass to high pass. And then let's just put that up there. So then I can basically just kind of, I can sort of map that to anything. And, your source can be anything, any of the envelopes, any of the LFOs. Yeah. So there's a lot of options in terms of how you can kind of set up the modulation. And then the last little section, which actually adds a lot to it, is the effects. So if we just go back to the main panel here, you can see you've got 3 different effects. So there's this output area here, which is main volume output. And then that's got a little soft clip, which is basically a built-in limiter. So all it means is that if it's peaking over 0, it's just going to kind of like, it's very softly kind of crunch those frequencies. So you can kind of be assured that you're never going to be peaking. You're never going to get clipping kind of going out of it. Cool. There's a little overdrive section. So add a little bit of like distortion to it as well. Chorus, so for a bit of width, you can add a bit of chorus. And then of course, delay, like a really nice analog sounding delay. And again, if you open up the sort of top panel, there's a whole effects area where you can kind of like really get into sort of how each of those effects sound. So again, with the distortion, set the drive amount. So you can make it like much more sort of aggressive. And then for the chorus, things like width and depth and all that kind of stuff. Again, if you're kind of seasoned at this sort of thing, like none of these should be too difficult to work out.
Do you think this is a really good synth for someone who's just learning synthesis?
Yes, absolutely. Because all the sort of basic properties are there. It's like I said, it's really uncomplicated, but yet it has everything you'd find in sort of a big modular or sort of a much more complicated synth. You've got your oscillators, you've got your filters, you've got envelopes and LFOs. So all these different things are there, and it's much easier to kind of get the hang of what's doing what. Yeah. Here than it might be, say, in something like the Moog Modular V, where you're looking at it and it's just.
This is a lot less terrifying than that, because we did that last time.
We did,
and I was like.
Yeah, I think it's way more straightforward. But that being said, it's incredibly powerful. And what Tom Oberheim ended up doing was there were 4 and 8 voice versions of this original synth. So some of the earliest, he was really a pioneer in terms of like polyphony. So being able to have a synthesizer that could create more than one voice.
So that was down to him?
He was one of the pioneers of the time, yeah. Oh. So you had like, there was the 4 voice version, which is basically, he literally just took 4 versions of the SEM, stuck them together with a keyboard and a couple of sort of extra controls. And then there was the Big Daddy, which is kind of the 8 voice. And, you know, Oberheim at the time were pretty successful. Like, you know, most companies building sort of like such, you know, sort of expensive and specialized gear, kind of, you know, got like bought out by different companies and sort of changed hands a few times. And it was actually in 2014, they brought a 2-voice version of the SEM kind of like back to life with a much more modern sequencer. And that's apparently done really well. It's a really cool piece of kit. So it's nice to see that this kind of sound engine is still, you know, it's still out there and people are still buying it. And yeah.
Wicked. Well, thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Cool,
yeah.
Thanks. I hope you guys found some inspiration for the weekend. And if you would like to find out more about music production, sound engineering, or DJing, head to our website, pointblankmusicschool.com, where you can find out more about our courses. We'll be back soon with another FFL, and have a lovely weekend.